Now we're approaching mid-January and it's time for scouting whitetails. It's at early season time, and I had another video that really the best time to get out in the woods and scout whitetails is right after the season ends. There's a lot of wintering whitetail ranges and habitat that can be very misleading. Cedar yards, thickets, areas where food shortages are down, deer are searching for daytime browse, and that browse component becomes more important as the winter moves on. And it can be very misleading where you find deer sign if you're searching in March, especially fresh pellets, fresh urine, fresh rubs, just because it doesn't actually signify where those deer were actually found and where they were at and spending their fall time and spending their time during the hunting season. And that's why shed hunting could be really misleading. I find a lot of times where deer drop sheds are not where they're at during the fall. And so typically I don't shed hunt. I'm on client property, so I find 20, 30 sheds a year in different states, but it's more we're walking around and looking. And when it comes to rubs though, I love rubs because there's several clues as, you know, certainly the size of the buck that made it and the timing of that rub. Now I don't rely on rubs a lot for example, this is a great rub. I wouldn't necessarily put a trail camera on here. A lot of times bucks hit a major rub like this, one time, two times at the most, three times, and then they're on. It doesn't mean that there's not another buck in this area or not that he's not in this area. It's just when he actually comes to a rub, it's not very often as compared to a mock scrape where it might be a daily pattern, a part of their daily lives, including does and fawns too. I look at a rub like this and there's a few things. Of course, it's a really nice tree. One thing I look for is the history of rubs. And what I like about the history of rubs is not that necessarily a buck is going to rub this tree every single year, but the history of rubs where you see the deep gouges and you can tell that historically bucks rub this tree in particular. I found those rubs that are just carved out from the side. They almost look like a sea out in the swamps in the UP of Michigan. I love those rubs. There's a few I have right in my mind right now that when I see rubs on those, when I see that they're active, then you know there's a big buck in the area. And so I love seeing a rub that actually has that historical sign on it like this. You know that there's a history of mature bucks on here. I've been to properties where, for whatever reason, you can tell that there's a certain year that a mature buck was there, rubbed a lot of trees, and then it's gone, and then it's just small rubs. And it might be you find out they had a giant buck in that area that one year. So finding current rub sign along with a historical rub sign, and you can look around the trees around here, you can tell that bucks have used this spot and they're in this area consistently year to year. So that's number one. That's really good to see that historical sign. Now when you're looking at a rub, you have the face of the rub right here, and that's where that buck will have his antlers turned like this, and he's carving out the inside. That'll polish the inside of his antler on his left side in this case, and then the right side beam is the inside of the beam is hitting up here. So you can tell he's facing like this. You can tell he got pretty aggressive with it one time and actually moved his head. And when he moved his head right down here, we have the chips and the marks from his tines that are fresh. You could tell he was rubbing this way, back and forth. In fact, probably coming downhill, facing into the brush. He turned his head one time and hit right here. So you can tell the face of the rub. You can tell which way he was actually facing when he came to that. It doesn't take much to imagine. And I love that kind of stuff because you're kind of looking at, you know, what did he do when he was here? Which way was he facing? Why did he do it here? So you tell he's facing this way. We got historical rub sign. At the same time, we have some little slivers of ticks back here. I always look at the backside and high of a rub. So you can tell the buck was facing like this when he rubbed, and then his tines are actually hitting up here. That's a good point because obviously his spike didn't make this probably a 2.5-year-old 8-point around here. It was at least a 3-year-old that had the width and the amount of beam to actually be here and then wrap all the way around and hit right here and tick into the tree. I've seen that scouting private land next to remote public land in different states where we get back on that public land and actually that's where the mature buck sign was at. And I can think of one spot in Michigan in the UP, that's about how far I'll narrow it down. But getting back to remote public land on the back of the landowner's property, we found rubs like this with deep gouges in the back. And those deep gouges in the back and high tell you that there's stickers and kickers and junk coming off that main beam. And so from the historical side, the way that buck was facing, you can tell he got aggressive with it, hit it down here. And then He's tipping up here, it tells you he's wide. If there's deep gouges on the back, then you can tell there's some stickers or something junk, something, an inside tine pointing. You love seeing that because a lot of times that determines age. You know, bucks express that non-typical gene sometimes early, but especially in areas where they're clean racks, they don't express that till 5-6 years of age, especially on public land. And so when you start seeing this on public land, you know that there's some older bucks around. That's a great sign. Obviously it's a big rub, but look a little deeper than that. Now another thing with this rub, something I really like looking at is this was an obvious hunting season rub. It was obviously probably mid-season. The leaves fall around here in late October. So when I find these shavings right here on top of the leaves, really important, these shavings are a part of the puzzle because you know that this rub was made late October or after, probably early November. Now another thing with these shavings, if you notice, I'm just picking them up for the first time right now. They're just laying here like this. We've had a lot of recent snows that could have packed this all down completely and crushed it into the ground, and that's how you'll find those shavings in the wintertime. But when they're fluffed up a little bit like this, you can tell they haven't been on the ground long enough to actually get flattened and compressed down with all the leaves and sticks from heavy snow. And so I would estimate, just best guess, that this rub was made probably mid-November, end of November, even during the second rut in December, but it was not made in October. It was after leaves. And you can tell a lot about a rub. You know, again, the historical portion of the rub is probably the most important. I believe you can determine age, especially on public land bucks where you're looking for deep gouges in areas on the tree where only antlers with a little bit of junk on it, non-typical characteristics, would be making that mark, or bucks are just not growing those non-typical characteristics till they get to 5 or 6 years old on public land. And I'd look at the timing right here, look at the way that buck was facing. You can tell how wide his antlers were approximately by how far the lift is up here, how high he's getting when he makes that rub, so you can tell an approximate age. Sure, a spike could have come along and rubbed this. Again, a big buck probably only came through here, I would guess, once or twice. If he came through here and he was aggressive on this rub 10 times, this would be just completely tore up. And a lot of times I see that it seems like they enjoy ripping the bark off it, so they'd continue working around on all sides. A lot of times the more and more rubs they make, they just keep ripping it apart. Then you have that side beam coming back and forth right here, tearing more bark off. So I would estimate this buck made this 1-2 times. And we know there's mature bucks in this area. We don't need the rub to see, but rubs are pretty cool, especially when you're scouting, especially when you're scouting public land. Try to find the timing of that. If these shavings were under the leaves, and obviously you know it was early and this wouldn't look as fresh too, it was more early season rubbing, that might dictate that buck's not even there during hunting season. So rubs can tell you a lot. I hope you've learned at least 1 or 2 things from watching this rub analyzing video and how to read a buck rub. But we're out here scouting, and this is one of my coolest things to find. You know, we found a pretty recent scrape under a vine, which was cool to find today too. But man, you can imagine the buck that made this, and we know a few on the property, so I'm sure it was one of the big ones. And I hope you're finding some cool rubs out on the properties you're scouting this winter time. And get out and scout. I'm hoping this video comes out here in the next week or two in January, but this is the time, the time to find these monster rubs on the property that you're hunting in 2019.